Hello, everybody. Welcome to this week's research seminar, the $15,000 question, looking at down payment assistance. Who's it designed to help and how might it work? This is part of our ongoing research seminar series, normally hosted by David Luberoff. I'm pinch hitting today for David. We have two left in this series. We just added one. We have one on April 23rd. How are landlords managing the COVID-19 rental crisis? Evidence from a large cross-site survey featuring Elijah De La Campa from a postdoc at the Kennedy School and his work looking at how small landlords have been affected by the crisis. And then on May 7th, and note that some of you may have gotten an email with their incorrect date, but on May 7th, we will have a recently added seminar, Multidimensional Housing Insecurity, a new approach to measuring, understanding, and addressing problems among renters. Some really interesting work by a doctoral student from Brandeis. So we're really excited to have added that to the series. A couple of logistical things. One, you'll note that subtitles are available for this seminar. If you don't want those scrolling along the bottom of your screen, you can turn them off using the Zoom features. Also, you can submit questions via Q&A. We will keep an eye on those. Just be aware of the fact that with several hundred people attending this event, we will by no means be able to get to all of your questions. We will attempt to answer as many as we can privately, and we try to pick a few questions that really kind of elevate higher issues that we think that will appeal to a broader segment of folks. So please be patient if we don't get a chance to get to your question. I will also, so today we have two speakers. And again, the seminar was really motivated by the Biden campaign's proposal to provide $15,000 in down payment assistance to first-time buyers. And that led to two research projects, one by Ben Ward, who was a recent graduate of the Kennedy School of Government and the Stanford Business School, who is looking at examples of large-scale first-time buyer programs in other countries to see what lessons those programs might have for the design of such a program in the US. And we'll hear from Ben first. And then after Ben, we'll hear from Raheem from the Joint Center, who will be looking at more of a quantitative question about who is, particularly among Black and Hispanic renters, which households are ready to be able to purchase a home and who will be most likely to benefit from such down payment assistance and kind of scale the potential impact of that program. So two really interesting takes on an important question. So we're excited to have the chance to share both of those with you today. So let me first turn it over to Ben Ward. Ben, to share your review of some down payment assistance programs for the US to learn from. Welcome, Ben.
Great, thanks, Chris. Let me share my screen. Is that visible? Can you see that, Chris?
Looks great. Yes.
Okay, great. Awesome. Yeah, well, thanks everyone for having me. As Chris touched on, my research project looked at a series of down payment assistance programs in 5 other countries and hoping to gain some lessons from that the Biden administration could use in designing a nationwide down payment assistance process here in the US. A little quick intro on me, and Chris already gave this, so thank you. And this is a photo from me from the pre-COVID times, back when we used to wear suits. I was a graduate student at the Harvard Kennedy School, graduated last year, and I focused on housing policy. And particularly interested in down payment assistance and helping sort of first-time home buyers enter the housing market, particularly in markets that we have right now, which are pretty expensive and difficult for lower income folks and first-time home buyers to crack into that market. So the objective of this paper was to help US policymakers design a nationwide down payment assistance program. And to do this research sort of took 3 steps and looked at 3 things. First, we examined the series of international programs. So we looked at Canada, England, Ireland, Australia, and New Zealand. Each of those countries have robust nationwide down payment assistance programs. Then what I did was synthesize these lessons into what I call design choices. So considered these almost like a menu of policy options, sort of common themes that emerged from each of these foreign jurisdictions that policymakers here in the US could sort of pick and choose from. And then third, based upon that, made a set of proposals for US policymakers here that Biden might use to design the sort of $15,000 down payment assistance program that was proposed. And the sort of two key findings from this research were, number one, policymakers must target the down payment assistance program, and they need to target it towards those households that wouldn't have otherwise been able to buy a home. Now, I sort of cringe when I say this because you're probably thinking, well, yeah, that's obvious. But actually examining these international case studies, you'd be sort of surprised to find that this wasn't, in fact, this was rarely the case in any of these international jurisdictions. And I'll sort of explain why that was the case shortly. And then second was, as I mentioned earlier, that based upon examining these foreign jurisdictions, there is sort of a pretty clear set of themes that emerge across all of these programs. And what emerges is a set of options, design choices is what I call them, that policymakers can pick and choose from in order to affect the targetedness of a program that might be designed here. So I'll go through each of these sort of three findings and three steps in turn. So the first thing we did in this research was examine these international programs, and the way I did this primarily twofold. First was just looking at sort of public and popular media reporting in each of these countries. And you can see here there was sort of a range of perspectives in each of these countries, both between them and within them. You can see here some headlines that I've grabbed out. Top left is in Canada, and the media is complaining that not enough people are using the program. The bottom left is talking about the program in the UK, and it's complaining that too many people are using the program, particularly that wealthy people are using it. The two headlines on the right are from New Zealand, and those articles, the first is complaining that not enough are using the program, and the bottom is saying that, oh, it's too much, too many people might use it and that might overheat the market. So what you can see is that there was quite obviously a range of perspectives within each of these countries, I guess, as you would expect for any piece of public policy. And then the second thing that we did was we looked, to the extent that it was possible, at sort of independent analysis from either think tanks, treasury departments within each of these countries that, analysed more quantitatively what the sort of impact of these programs were, its reach, and any impacts, if at all, on, the rate of homeownership and the housing market more broadly. And there's a lot more detail in the paper, which I'll sort of refer to later on. Then the second thing we did was, based upon these learnings, was to synthesize this into a set of design choices, this sort of menu of policy options. And so there's quite a lot here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to sort of slowly build up this framework that I've synthesized from these studies. So the first is sort of a set of criteria or a set of options that might be deployed to increase or decrease the level of targetedness of the program. And by that, what I mean is, really sort of being able to narrow in on what is the demographic, what is the sort of I guess the income level, the sort of class distribution of the recipients of this down payment assistance. And there were kind of 7 criteria that emerged consistently across each of these foreign jurisdictions. So things that policymakers could do is put an income limit on the recipients, a purchase price limit on the price of the home. They could implement some sort of demographic criteria. So a lot of jurisdictions, for example, limited it to first home buyers, but not all of those did. Theoretically, there could also be other demographic criteria that could be applied. There were geographic constraints. So this could take the form of different price targets or different requirements depending on the city, for example, that a home buyer was purchasing in. Number 5 was the sort of the structure of the payment itself. So the Biden proposal is to use a tax credit refund, but there's other sort of alternate structures. There could be a unconditional cash grant, or there could be a shared equity structure where the government actually takes an ownership stake in the home. The 6th was there could be sort of differing requirements depending upon whether it was an existing property or one that was newly built. And then finally, the form of assistance could be either fixed or variable. So it could be a fixed sort of cash payment, or it could be variable depending on the actual purchase price of the home. So this was the kind of first dimension of the framework. The sort of thing that I guess I sort of implied or extended from that was, if you think about each of these criteria, you can think of each of these as a dial that you could turn one way or the other. And depending on which way you turn that dial, these criteria make the program either more or less targeted. So you can sort of target a higher income demographic or a wealthier demographic, or a less wealthy, lower income demographic. And that also has a second order impact that is relevant in the sense that it can actually impact the housing market itself. So if a program is less targeted and thus it's capturing more people and higher income and wealthier people, in some of these jurisdictions, what we found was that, or what some of the local media reporting and economic analysis found, was that the housing market itself was inflated. So, and this is, I guess, simple supply and demand economics, but if you give a ton of people more money, those people bid up the price of housing, and sort of paradoxically, this program that is designed to increase affordability or increase access can actually end up having the opposite impact, which is to exacerbate affordability issues. And then I guess the next part of this framework is, once you have decided the level of targetedness, the sort of next step that policymakers need to make is the actual amount of assistance. And, this is what it means. It's, the cash value, the dollar value of the assistance that you're giving to those recipients. Now, the reason why I've kind of set this out as a part 2 is because the actual dollar value of the assistance that you provide is in some ways contingent on the targetedness of the program. So if you imagine that you've got a sort of a fixed pot of money, you could decide to spread that pot of money more thinly across a greater number of people if the program is less targeted, or you could more tightly target that program, go narrower and deeper, and provide a greater level of assistance to a sort of smaller number of people. And in that situation, you would be targeting presumably a more needy demographic, or a demographic that is further away from achieving home ownership. And in doing that, you might actually be bumping more people across the line into achieving home ownership. And then finally, what I've just sort of done here is summarize where each of those jurisdictions that I examined fall on each of these spectrums. There's obviously a lot here, but I just wanted to give a little bit of a flavor to show, I guess, the diversity of the range that some of these criteria could take. And again, I'll sort of signpost that when the paper is published in a couple of weeks, all this will be broken down in a lot more detail. So if you're curious, you can find, I guess, all the data and detail that sits behind this. But for the purposes of this presentation, I think there's kind of 2 key things I wanted to call out. One, there's no clear, I guess, trend that you could draw, or no sort of pattern that you could draw across I guess, where you see each of these countries distributed here. There is a bit of a sort of scattershot approach that each country has taken on each of these dimensions. And then I think the other key call that I'd want to make is, there's a pretty wide range of values that take place here. So, if we look at income limit, for example, New Zealand was on the lower end of that spectrum, with a 130,000 New Zealand dollar sort of upper cap to people who are eligible for this program. There were 3 countries, Ireland, Australia, and the UK, who had no limit at all. So even, the highest income earners were able to receive this assistance. Likewise for the purchase price limit. And also, if you look at probably most starkly the level of assistance itself down the bottom there, you can see that on the very high end, the UK, England was actually providing up to £240,000 of assistance per person as an upper limit. And again, when you consider that there was actually no income limit on receiving that assistance, you can imagine that a lot of sort of high income people buying expensive homes were accessing that assistance. And again, on the lower end there, you can see New Zealand had a $10,000 limit on its assistance. So again, you can see quite a range of sort of ways that policymakers in each of these countries have turned each of these dials. And then finally, sort of based upon each of this, wanted to, suggest a few proposals for US policymakers. So the first is that, tightly targeting the program is key. And this is what we call the but-for test. And as I sort of mentioned earlier, a lot of these international examples, and you could sort of see from some of those headlines, especially the UK, these sort of jurisdictions were criticised domestically for being far too loose in their targeting. So the UK in particular, there were lots of negative headlines around doctors and lawyers are accessing this assistance. Why is this money being spent the way it is? And as I said, it seems obvious, but I'm just going to say it anyway, because this clearly wasn't the case in some jurisdictions. The only way to increase the rate of home ownership, like mathematically, is to assist people who wouldn't have otherwise accessed home ownership but for this assistance. So I do think that is a really important mental model that needs to be kept in mind, that this assistance should be going towards people who you are pushing over the line into achieving home ownership. And if you're not doing this, then, at the extreme example, you're giving money to doctors and lawyers to help them buy bigger and better houses. You're not increasing the rate of home ownership. And in fact, you're potentially doing the opposite, which is negatively impacting the housing market by further increasing prices, which is pushing home ownership further away for those folks that you probably wanted to target in the first place. And I mentioned the UK as an extreme example, but to greater and lesser extents, each of these foreign jurisdictions experienced this to some extent, which was being criticised or potentially not targeting their funds at the most needy demographics. And then the second recommendation, which is related to this, is that policymakers really need to clearly define who the program is for and manage public expectations accordingly. So I guess the flip side of what I just talked about in the UK is that, especially in Canada and New Zealand, policymakers were criticised for not being generous enough. And so these were sort of two of the jurisdictions that were more on the targeted end of the spectrum. But there, what you found was, popular media and, potential homeowners complaining, oh, I still can't afford to buy a house in Toronto, even with this assistance that is being given. And there you sort of see the popular media picking up, these sort of sob stories, for want of a better word, like, look at this relatable middle-class family, they've tried really hard, they've got good jobs, but they still can't afford to buy a home. Like, what's the government doing? We need to increase the level of assistance. And so in those sort of situations, what you saw was some of the public support for these programs fall away. So policymakers do need to be cognizant of the political cost of tightly targeting the programs, but that's why I said you need to be clear from the outset who these programs are intended to serve. And I would argue that the purpose of these programs isn't to help middle-class families buy nicer houses or bigger houses. So public expectations need to be managed, pretty tightly there. Otherwise, you're going to see these popular sort of media reports saying that these programs haven't been effective. The third lesson would be to be deliberate about the amount of assistance provided. So as Chris sort of flagged in the intro, Biden's campaign listed this proposal for a $15,000 tax credit. And obviously we're going to hear a lot more about that from Raheem shortly. What my research shows is actually this puts the US at the lower end of that spectrum in terms of generosity. Not saying whether that's a good or a bad thing necessarily, but sort of something to be deliberate about. And there was this study by Perkins et al, and there's the link can be found there in the footnotes, that found 30% of what they described as potential homeowners, which is actually 12 million people, would be able to achieve home ownership in a median priced home in their county of residence with down payment assistance of sort of $10,000 or less. So if you take that study and that data point, then actually $15,000 may be quite effective in meaningfully moving the level of home ownership. But, be deliberate and keep in mind that that amount of assistance is unlikely to assist many home buyers in high cost markets in areas like, New York, San Francisco, Boston. So again, policymakers need to be deliberate about who they're targeting and what the impact of this will be. Fourth recommendation is to use the program to stimulate new housing supply. So all of these foreign jurisdictions tied their programs in some shape or form to new housing supply, whether that's restricting the subsidy only to those newly built homes, or providing an extra sort of bonus subsidy to those who are buying newly built homes. And the logic behind this is to try and take that or mitigate that inflationary pressure in the housing market, and B, to try to stimulate new housing supply, which would sort of improve affordability more broadly. And then the final recommendation would be to improve execution by maintaining a sort of simplified nationwide approach. So all of these jurisdictions had very clear, simple nationwide programs. And this meant that the programs were well understood by home buyers, lenders, home builders, all the kind of key stakeholders. And that really, aided in the sort of, I guess, the deployment and the effectiveness of the programs. Now, this is in contrast to the United States' current approach, which is a patchwork of over 2,500 state and local programs, each with their own requirements, each with their own application forms. And I guess that kind of balkanization of down payment assistance in the US has potentially impacted its effectiveness. So as the Biden administration considers how to roll this out, we'd recommend that they maintain a single unified approach and resist the urge to kind of fragment this locally. So existing infrastructure in HUD or the IRS could be used to deploy this program. Yeah, and as I said, in the coming weeks, we'll be publishing this final paper that has all of this detail behind it that you can refer to if you're interested. Obviously, this was just a pretty high-level summary. So yeah, stay tuned for that. And yeah, happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, Ben. Terrific. And as I should have noted at the outset, is that this paper will be forthcoming. We're editing it. It will be coming out sometime soon in the spring. So keep your eye on the Joint Center website for that. And the same is true of Raheem's paper. So there's a couple of questions. I guess one thing we kind of skipped over, Ben, and there was a question that says, well, why down payment assistance? Why not just insurance for mortgage defaults? So why is down payment assistance to start with important as a way to access homeownership?
Yeah, so the reason why that is I guess a lot of research to date has shown, or I guess the term that I've seen used is this kind of down payment gap, or the sort of down payment hurdle, where, given that interest rates are so low, I guess that has two impacts. One, it inflates property prices, which I guess increases that distance between, the ability of folks with savings to sort of make a purchase. But also it, I guess makes the serviceability of those loans lower. So, what this research has found is if you just, if people can just sort of bridge that gap and then enter into home ownership, that they should be able to sort of service those mortgages. And as I said, I guess I referenced a couple of articles there, but yeah, in the final paper, you'll see, a lot of studies that have shown that, yeah, down payment assistance is a good way to bridge that gap. And I guess maybe second order, and this is more for me personally, the reason why I was interested in this topic is, I guess I didn't flag, but it's probably obvious to everyone, I'm from Australia. Australia's had a down payment assistance program for many years and received a lot of media attention. And I guess I was surprised that it didn't feel like the topic was getting as much attention here in the US. So I thought it might be interesting to sort of draw on some of those international examples.
Great. Yeah, and I think that the paper you cited, Kristen Perkins and some other folks here, it turns out that not a lot of cash can actually move a lot of people across the line. So for many people, that lack of cash is really important. There's a couple of technical questions about tax credits. I just to kind of to deal with those. And so the question about, well, don't tax credits, they don't help lower income households, they don't come when you need it. But the Biden campaign proposal actually was for a refundable tax credit. So it wouldn't be just a function of your marginal tax rate. And it's a credit, not a deduction. And it was also payable at the closing table. So they solved that problem by saying, when you go to the closing table, the IRS will write a check for that $15,000 to be able to use at that time. So
absolutely, yeah. And actually, and I guess maybe a slightly different take on that as well as the Ireland example. So the Ireland example, again, used a tax credit and it was also paid upfront at the time of closing. So I think that's a good model. Theirs was maybe slightly less targeted towards lower income folks. So it was actually a refund of previously paid tax. So it was, I guess, naturally capped by the amount of tax that you had paid before. So yeah, right. Less so addressing the issue that you described.
So Ben, one of the questions that come through that, you frame this as in the US case, looking to increase the homeownership rate. But in looking across these examples from other countries, were there differences in policy objectives between the countries you examined? And was that reflected in the way the programs were designed or structured? Were they all aimed at increasing homeownership, or do they have other things they were trying to accomplish, would you say?
Yeah, I'd say it was pretty uniform in each of these countries that increasing the rate of home ownership was the objective. I'd say often maybe it was expressed less succinctly or articulately than that. A lot of it was, sort of framed, which I think echoes to some extent the narrative that you see here in the US of, look at our poor kids these days, look at how expensive home prices are, how on earth is, the next generation of first homeowners going to enter the market. So I'd say a lot of the narrative was around sort of targeting first homeowners, and I guess in a sense it was more humanized than, the abstract, like let's raise the level of home ownership. And I'd say less framed from a sort of perspective of maybe like class or sort of racial equity, so to speak. It was much more around almost sort of generational, is kind of how I would describe it. Yeah.
So Ben, one of your recommendations was to focus on the expanding new supply. So one of the questions is, so what about in markets where there's an excess of supply? Would you still want to have that focus on new supply in places where there is plenty of building to go around and maybe more rehab need than new construction?
Yeah, that's a good question, good point. Yeah, I guess, and maybe I'd use new supply as a bit of a shorthand. In some of these jurisdictions, Ireland, for example, sort of rehab or refurbishments were eligible for this assistance as well. So, yeah, certainly policymakers here could consider that. Yeah, so I think that's a fair point.
And there's also a question about occupancy restrictions or triggers to pay back if a home is sold. Could you say, you have a shared equity approach as one of the dimensions?
Yeah.
Maybe say a bit too about how those programs worked and what you think the pros and cons of those were.
Yeah. So both Canada and the UK adopted sort of shared equity approaches, which was the governments in those countries actually took an ownership stake in the homes in return for that down payment assistance, and that partly explains why the on paper dollar value of assistance in the UK was so high, up to £240,000. It's because the government was actually taking an equity stake in those homes. So without sort of getting into the weeds of how those programs worked, the government gave this cash up front at the time of closing. And when that property was eventually sold, that money was refunded or returned to the government as a pro rata share of the sale price of the house. So the government actually took on, risk to that extent. To the extent that house prices went down, they would get less of their money back. But they also received a sort of pro rata share of the appreciation of those homes as well. So yeah, there was some nuances around sort of payback terms and stuff like that, but I don't think we need to get into the weeds here. Yeah.
I'm just looking through the questions here to see. We have about a minute left. One last question. I guess one question with early on too had to do with the degree of affordability in these countries. To what extent are there differences in how much of a stretch home ownership is and how that related to the structure of these programs? Were there big differences between New Zealand, Australia, Ireland, England, Britain in how affordable housing is? Did that get reflected in their programs?
Yeah, I don't think so. I think each of these countries had, pretty similar affordability challenges. And I think are broadly analogous to the United States as well, in the sense that, they have their sort of high cost urban markets and, certainly more affordable markets in those countries as well. So, no, I'd say they're sort of broadly analogous. I'm not sure that as a dimension sort of influenced the particular programs.
Great. Well, there's a ton of questions there, Ben. Maybe you can take a look at them as we turn to Raheem to see if there's more that you can answer. I'm sorry we can't get to all of them. The number of the questions are having to deal, though, with this question about racial inequalities and closing the racial wealth gap. And that's expressly the focus of Raheem's paper. So thank you, Ben. Look, for those of you interested in the topic, do stay tuned looking for that paper. But let me now introduce Raheem Hanifa, who will speak to this question of what impact a $15,000 down payment assistance might have, in particular on increasing opportunities for homeownership for Black and Hispanic renter households. And this is, again, ongoing work Raheem is leading with myself and Dan McCue of the Joint Center, and will be a forthcoming paper, a little behind Ben's, but sometime soon. So Raheem, thanks for being with us. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. And I first like to start off by thanking Chris, Herbert, and Dan McCue for their assistance in developing this paper. I'd also like to thank Whitney Aragood-Obricki, Joint Center researcher who also assisted in developing some of the code that underpins this analysis. And as we've just heard and discussed, down payment assistance programs seek to provide access to homeownership for the many prospective home buyers who struggle with accumulating the savings needed for a down payment assistance, for a down payment mortgage. And let me just share my screen as well, so you all can see my slides. Can you all see my slide?
Looks good.
Okay, great. And according to a recent Zillow study, about a third of renters from 20 major metro areas cited the down payment as a barrier to home ownership, underscoring the importance of down payment assistance for many home buyers who couldn't afford home ownership otherwise. While many details of the Biden down payment assistance program have yet to be revealed, the Biden campaign has proposed, as we've discussed, $15,000 in down payment assistance for first-time home buyers in the form of a refundable tax credit available to buyers at closing. And moving into our research questions. Our first question aims to identify the population of Black and Hispanic renters who have the incomes necessary to afford home ownership, but are presumably prevented from purchasing a home due to not having savings for a down payment. So we start by thinking about where homeownership needs are the greatest and how the down payment assistance can most immediately bring Black and Hispanic renters who are ready to purchase a home into a sustainable mortgage, but they don't have the down payment funds needed. Our second question aims to identify the effects of bringing what we call income-ready renters into home ownership on home ownership gaps between white homeowners and Black and Hispanic homeowners. And lastly, we identify the cost of the assistance to Black and Hispanic income-ready renters by area median income level and state. So we use the 2019 American Community Survey data to estimate homeownership rate gaps for Black and Hispanic homeowners compared to white homeowners for 8 AMI categories for each state for households between the ages of 25 to 55. So we limit the age range to best identify first-time home buyers. We then use median income amounts for Black and Hispanic renters in each AMI category to determine an attainable mortgage price for each AMI income range per state. Some of our assumptions include, for a standard 30-year fixed rate mortgage, such as a 2.8% interest rate, 2% property taxes, 0.5% insurance, and 3% down payment amount. After that, we move to determine what we call income-ready renters. And to do this, we first identify the number of homeowners needed to close homeownership gaps between white homeowners and Black and Hispanic homeowners for each AMI category and state. So again, as Ben's paper alluded to, thinking about where the need is to target the program. So we call these renters potential homeowners. Again, that group that is needed to close the gap between Black and Hispanic homeowners and white households. We then compared the attainable home price amount for each AMI category to the Zillow median home price for the state to identify which potential homeowners are actually income ready, meaning that they can afford the median priced home in their state. And then based on that number of income ready renters, we determine the cost of providing the assistance. So when taking a step back to look at the homeownership rates, we see stark differences in homeownership rates for Black and Hispanic homeowners compared to white homeowners. Kind of Looking at the broader population of US households across the country is what we start by, and then we narrow that down, as I mentioned, to 25 to 55-year-olds. So we see white home ownership rates range from 66% for those 25 to 55 years of age to 72% for all white homeowners. Black homeowners have lower rates of home ownership than not only white homeowners, but Hispanic homeowners as well. And Hispanic homeowners of all age ranges have about an 8% higher home ownership rate than Black homeowners. And that amount increases to 10% for homeowners between 25 and 55 years old. And just this occurrence of Hispanics having higher home ownership rates than Black homeowners will come into play later in the presentation when we look at the distribution of income-ready renters. And given higher homeownership rates among Hispanics, the number of Hispanic potential homebuyers compared to potential Black homebuyers is lower for Hispanic households. And while we won't get into the reasons for these homeownership rate differences today, there is an extensive literature that has been written on homeownership disparities, including research on housing discrimination through redlining, labor market discrimination, as well as differences in credit and debt profiles. So homeownership rates increase as income increases for all households in our analysis. The differences in homeownership rates by income range are significant and quite large. So ranging from 34 to 84% for white homeowners, 20 to 67% for Hispanic homeowners, and 13 to 62% for Black homeowners. We see the middle income bands from 50 to 100% of AMI have varying home ownership rates from as low as 22 to 60%. So essentially, we see significant variation of home ownership rates by income. And this is another question that comes up, and Ben raised this point as well, regarding to what extent do we target the program based on income. However, even though homeownership rates increase as incomes increase, as well as gaps decrease, the gap still remains significantly large, even at the highest income bands. For instance, even though the white-Black homeownership gap decreases from 32% generally to 18% at the highest income levels, that 18% still represents over 370,000 Black potential homeowners that will be needed to come into homeownership to close that gap. Likewise, for Hispanic homeowners whose gap decreased from 22% generally to 13% at the highest income levels, that 13% represents over 235,000 potential Hispanic homeowners needed to close those gaps. And this is another representation of how the homeownership gaps decrease at the higher income ranges. And again, we see that the gaps remain significant even at the highest income bands. Moving on. So moving into some of our more key findings, we identified the number of potential homeowners by AMI range and state. And again, that is the number of Black and Hispanic renters needed to come into homeownership to close homeownership gaps. And collectively, we see that over 1.8 million Black potential homeowners and 930,000 potential Hispanic homeowners are present. And the largest number of these potential Black homeowners were between the 50 to 80% AMI range at about 400,000, followed by the 30% or below range. And then the third largest group was the 120% AMI range. So you see a lot of variation from lower income folks to middle income to higher income individuals and households who would be brought into homeownership if they had down payment assistance. And similarly, the three largest groups for Hispanic potential homeowners were in these categories, but slightly different. The largest group of potential Hispanic homeowners was at the 120% AMI range. And then after that, followed by the 30% AMI range. And then the 50 to 80% AMI range had the largest amount of income or potential home buyers. So after identifying this larger group of potential home buyers, we then identify the number of income-ready renters in our sample. And to determine this number, we dropped the potential homeowners that did not have the needed incomes to attain the median priced home in their state. And we see that all 380,000 potential home buyers that were under 30% of AMI drop out of the sample. Additionally, we see most potential homeowners from the 30 to 50% AMI range also drop out of the sample. So that's 330,000 Black potential homeowners under 50% of AMI who fall out of the sample, leaving just 48,000 Black potential homeowners who now we call income ready, that are within 30 to 50% of AMI. And these potential home buyers could afford the median priced home in their state. Additionally, we see 164,000 Hispanic potential home buyers with incomes under 50% drop out of our sample, leaving just 5% or 5,000 Hispanic income ready renters who are within the 30 to 50% AMI category. So essentially in most states, you at least need to be between 50 to 80% of the area median income to afford the typical home mortgage. And that increases once you get into higher cost states such as California. And just as previously demonstrated, we see that those few states that someone within 30 to 50% of AMI could actually purchase the median price home are largely in the South, Midwest, and one state in the East Coast. So these are largely low cost states compared to many other states across the country. So where do Black income ready renters primarily reside? We see that the top 10 states where Black income ready renters primarily reside are largely in Southern and Midwestern states, and New York is an exception. And these are primarily states with relatively low to moderate median home prices, as well as large Black populations. So the state with most Black income ready renters is Texas, with over 105,000 Black income ready renters, going down from Georgia, North Carolina, all the way down to South Carolina, which has the 10th largest Black population of income ready renters. So when you look at these groups by the AMI ranges, you'll see that the largest group of income ready renters for these top 10 states are within the 50 to 80% of AMI income range, with about 220,000 Black income ready renters in this income band. And the second largest group are those within the 120% income band. And essentially we see large opportunities to bring middle income as well as higher income Black renters into home ownership. And when looking at where Hispanic income ready renters primarily reside, we see more regional variation when compared to Black income ready renters. So 4 of the top states are in the East Coast, 4 in the South, 3 in the Midwest, 2 in the East Coast, and 1 in the West Coast. So a lot of variation here. And the largest group of Hispanic income ready renters we see in New York at about 100,000, followed by Florida, New Jersey, down to Washington State that has about 10,000 income ready Hispanic renters. About 155,000 of these income ready renters reside at the highest income spectrum within the 120% AMI income range, with the second highest group being between the 50 to 80% AMI range. So what are the impacts on Black and Hispanic homeownership rates if we use down payment assistance to bring into homeownership income-ready Black and Hispanic renters? And we identify that when bringing in 1.1 million Black income-ready renters, kind of the total number that we identify through down payment assistance, the Black homeownership rate increases by 13 percentage points from 34% to 47%. Which is a substantial increase in the Black homeownership rate that ultimately drops homeownership gaps for this group from 32 to 18%. Within income ranges, we see that the largest increase in the homeownership rate takes place at the 80 to 100% AMI level, with a 20% homeownership rate increase, and followed by kind of 19% in some of the middle income categories. We also see smaller or no increases for those under 50% of AMI. And for Hispanic households, we identify a 4% increase in the homeownership rate when bringing 500,000 income-ready Hispanic renters into homeownership. The homeownership rate increases the most for Hispanic income-ready renters at 120% or more of AMI at about 7.4%, followed by the 100 to 120% AMI category at about 6.8%, both around 7%. And then after that, more of the mid-range income categories. As alluded to earlier in the presentation, the higher homeownership rates for Hispanic households across the country result in fewer Hispanic renters to categorize as potential homeowners, which again is the number of homeowners needed to close the gaps between white homeowners and Black and Hispanic homeowners. Because white Hispanic gaps are smaller than white Black homeownership gaps, there are fewer Hispanic potential homeowners to transition into homeownership, hence the lower Hispanic homeownership rate increases in our analysis. The cost of providing the assistance to Black and Hispanic income-ready renters ranges from $15 to $24 billion. While the Biden campaign's proposal did not have income limits, and again, more details of the program are forthcoming, it is a policy question to consider if the program should be capped at a certain income level, as Ben's presentation discussed earlier. So providing the assistance to all income-ready Black and Hispanic renters will cost $24 billion or $2.4 billion a year over 10 years. If we were to cap the eligibility for the assistance at 120% of AMI, we would decrease the cost of the program by $9 billion, putting the final price tag at $15 billion or $1.5 billion over 10 years. For context, a recent Brookings study found that the mortgage interest tax deduction costed the federal government between 30 to 60 billion a year. So the down payment assistance amount here needed to bring in Black and Hispanic income-ready renters into homeownership would be well below the amount of some existing homeownership policies. A trade-off, of course, of capping the eligibility would be a decrease in the amount of the impact of the assistance would have on homeownership rates between Black and Hispanic homeowners. So we see a 2% decrease in the homeownership rate for Hispanic homeowners and a 4% decrease for Black homeowners if you take out that 120% AMI category, capping the eligibility at that point. As mentioned previously, the Biden campaign's proposal targeted the down payment assistance to first-time home buyers. However, if the program aims to get the most bang for its buck, it may consider additional targeting to Black and Hispanic homeowners who have large homeownership gaps compared to white homeowners. As a first step, identifying the Black and Hispanic renters who lack savings to pay for down payment, but do have the incomes to sustain the typical mortgage in their state, and targeting assistance to these groups would be a way to most immediately work homeownership gaps. While the Fair Housing Act prohibits considering race in the provision of housing, there may be opportunities through the Equal Credit Opportunity Act and the exemptions provided through its special purpose credit program, which allows lenders to favorably consider prohibited factors such as race or ethnicity in connection with a special purpose, which may include initiatives for low-income borrowers of color. So the Biden administration may consider employing this program to target the proposed down payment assistance program to Black and Hispanic home buyers in efforts to reduce the substantial homeownership gaps for these demographics. Additionally, the administration could consider additional supports needed to transition prospective home buyers into homeownership, such as financial counseling, home buyer education, and also, as we've discussed, targeting the program by income is a remaining question. And as Chris mentioned earlier, today, this report is ongoing and we hope to publish the paper sometime around this summer, but some next steps in our analysis include identifying income-ready renters at the metro area level, as well as conducting regression analysis to identify the effects that different down payment assistance amounts have on increasing homeownership rates and reducing gaps. We would also like to expand the analysis to include additional demographics, including Asians and low to middle income whites. And with that, that's my main points for my presentation. There'll be more information forthcoming in the paper, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Raheem. That's terrific. So there's been a number of questions in the chat. I guess trying to clarify a few things. So one thing is the analysis does not take into account things like credit scores, and perhaps most importantly, we also don't have information about savings. And so in some sense, this is an upper bound estimate of who's income ready, but not ready otherwise. And so I think when Raheem was talking about what else is needed in terms of homebuyer education and counseling, financial literacy training, financial education, the like, to address some of those barriers. So this is, in some sense, an upside. There's also a good question in the chat, or a point made in the chat about, we call this down payment assistance, but in fact, it's really cash grants that can go for a variety of purposes. And so various analyses that have been done, it's not just to meet the down payment requirement, it's to meet closing cost requirements. It's also to help potentially pay for debts that have accumulated that may make it difficult to qualify for home ownership. So Raheem, I just want to throw those out there. There's also a number of questions about the ways in which the analysis assumes people uses the median priced home as the target. Can you say a bit more about our thinking around that choice and how we kind of allowed for some wiggle room there?
Yeah, so we include a few assumptions regarding kind of basing the analysis off of kind of the median home price, while acknowledging that there is variation within a state, within metros, regarding home prices. So we did include just 80% of the Zillow median home price to allow for some wiggle room for home buyers to be able to purchase homes that are kind of less than the Zillow home price. So that would allow these prospective home buyers to be included as potential home buyers. So we didn't have a sharp cutoff, but that is a good question that does speak to that there are assumptions being made here that we are attempting to determine who is income ready and who isn't.
Yeah, and it is challenging. I know the Urban Institute has done some work around this too. And I think trying to think about the distribution of home prices and then looking at the incomes and what share of the price distribution they can afford would be a more refined approach. For this purpose, we didn't go down that far and just apply this more rough estimate just to get a sense of the scale of and the income bands where the program would be most likely to have an impact. Raheem, there's one other question too. Somebody was surprised that Arizona wasn't among the list of states where there'd be a big attempt to or ability to close the gap or income ready Hispanic buyers. I think California was another state. Could you say a bit about the states that are missing from there and why they might be missing?
Yeah, there were definitely some surprises when we conducted the analysis. Some of the reasons for that is in relation to the homeownership gaps themselves. We noticed that across the various income bands, even though there were large numbers of Hispanic renters in places like California, actually the gaps within certain income bands weren't very large or were non-existent. And as a starting point, this analysis seeks to identify the potential home buyers kind of within those gaps, and what would it take to bring those prospective home buyers into home ownership. So as I did allude to in the presentation, there was a lower number of Hispanic prospective home buyers or income-ready renters because their gaps were smaller compared to Black homeowners.
I think one of the other things we should note is that Raheem focused on states where there's the greatest number of homeowners who were potential homeowners. If you look at it in terms of the largest gaps, a lot of the states that pop up are states like Iowa and Minnesota and places where there are few people of color. And so we focused on the states where the gaps may not be as large, but the number of households affected would be. And ultimately, the paper will present all this information for every state. That's the idea, is to kind of drill down, and hopefully we'll do it for large metropolitan areas as well. Just looking at the Q&A here to see there are other questions that we can. Raheem, do you want to say anything too about we at one point we had considered looking at the kind of ways in which the amount of down payment assistance could affect the kind of range of homes available for sale. Could you say a little bit about our thinking there and how we were looking at the potential there to expand purchasing power?
Yeah, so again, an earlier iteration, we were looking at just the available properties within a state and to what degree would the down payment assistance give you greater access to a higher range of or higher cost homes. We ended up kind of not including that in this analysis, but that is something that we do want to take a look at going forward. Kind of as I mentioned, we are planning on looking at just the degree to which the down payment amount brings in homeowners and increases homeownership rates and reduces gaps. So I think that is likely going to be a part of kind of the future analysis of this ongoing research.
Okay, and there's a number of chats in here as well that are helpful in terms of thinking about how we might think about different sources of the home price data as well. The fact that we will look at this at the metro level, in fact, because a place like California, if you're taking the state level house price, it's obviously very different in the Bay Area than it is in, say, Stockton. So that is certainly analysis that we want to do as well. There's a question about the availability of the housing stock, and so there, is it not just affordable, but is it in of the quality of the type? And I guess I don't know, Raheem, if you have any thoughts too about how we might deal with the kind of stock, the supply side questions as part of this.
Yeah, that is a good question, and particularly right now, as kind of the supply of homes is quite limited, which is a part of why home prices have surged, as well as low interest rates. So that is a good question, and I think that is something that we can explore in the next iteration of our work.
Yes, and I think we're right up at the end, and I really appreciate a lot of the comments and the questions that are coming through the chat that'll help this work ongoing. We definitely will be looking at extending this not just to Black and Hispanic renters, but other renters of color, as well as looking at it for lower income white households as well, and thinking about a broader program. Keeping in mind the first half of this seminar, Ben Ward's work, obviously, if the goal is to close homeownership gaps, thinking about how to target the program so that but for this, we get people into homeownership to help close those gaps. Thinking about racial equity issues, there's challenges in how do you target a program by race. There was a question in the chat about the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. Are there examples of that? I'm not aware of any, but I'm hoping that there are some, and we'll try to lift those up as well. But I think it's been a very underused provision of that act, and one that I think people are now more attuned to. So this is very much work in progress. Raheem, thank you so much for all that you've done. And again, folks who have thoughts and comments on this, send them along so we can refine this work. Thank you to Ben Ward too for your work. I think really interesting work, and look for that paper. I think some examples from those other countries will be really interesting for the US to consider. Just want to close by saying, this issue about particularly the racial gaps in home ownership and how large they are and how much as a country, I think this is a real important aspect of racial inequality that we really do need to address. And so thinking about these programs, the structures of these programs, their potential, and how we can best target them is important. And we hope to keep contributing to that discussion. So thank you all for tuning in, and thank you to Raheem and Ben. So be well, see you soon.